You're going to want to know these 5 things before you buy a new lathe. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I'm going to share with you 5 things that you're going to want to know before you purchase your new lathe. Now, these aren't going to be the basic ordinary things like pricing and budget and that. You're going to figure those things out on your own. Instead, I'm going to talk about 5 things that a lot of people don't mention, but if you're not aware of them before you make your lathe purchase, you may be disappointed down the road. So let's jump right into these 5 things that you're going to want to know before you purchase your lathe. Number 1, size matters. Yes, there are different sizes of lathes. You can start off with a mini lathe, which is a very small lathe. Typically, these are used for pin turnings and small turnings like that. Now, they're not great for turning bowls. If you want to turn the world's smallest bowl, they might actually be ideal. And I've got a video all about that here if you're interested. So between the mini lathes and the full-size lathes, there's a category of lathes called MIDI, M-I-D-I. They're kind of in the middle or the MIDI section of the categories of lathes. Now, if you're looking to do medium to small size bowls, a MIDI lathe can be perfect for you. A good example of a MIDI lathe is the Jet 1221 variable speed. You can make all sorts of different bowls with this. Now, the only downside is you won't be able to make very large bowls, or if you have really heavy, wet green wood, it could be a little bit of a struggle turning on a MIDI lathe. Most bowl turning is done on full-size lathes. And a full-size lathe is usually a freestanding lathe that's larger than the MIDI. They can range in quality, in motor size, and there's a whole variety of different styles of full-size lathes. But typically for wood bowl turning, you're going to be looking for a full-size lathe. There are 4 measurements you're going to want to know about the lathe that you're considering. The first one is the swing. The swing is the largest amount of material that can be turned on the lathe, or the diameter of the material that can be turned on the lathe. So for instance, if you have a lathe that has an 8-inch radius, or from the center of the headstock to the rails is 8 inches, then you can do a 16-inch swing or a 16-inch diameter. Now, what's important to know about that is that when they say 16-inch, or if you have a 12-inch swing, keep in mind it's going to be nearly impossible to make an actual 12-inch bowl on a 12-inch swing, because you're going to need to remove material as you're turning. So typically the swing size is the maximum that you can have on there, and you're going to be turning something that's less than that. So if you know that you want to make bowls that are 12, 13, 14 inch, then you're much better off getting a 16-inch swing lathe or larger. So that's really important to understand. The next measurement that you're going to want to know is your headstock spindle threads. The threads on the headstock spindle are very important to know their size, because that is the size you're going to need to get all of your accessories that attach to the headstock to match. Most headstocks in the United States are either 1-inch diameter by 8 threads per inch, or 1¼ inch diameter by 8 threads per inch. Now, there are different size headstocks all around the world, so you're going to need to actually check what your lathe headstock measurement is and make sure you understand that before you purchase a lathe. Now, this is going to be important, especially if you have existing accessories. If you have a chuck maybe that you've been using that's a certain size, the lathe that you're purchasing might not have that same exact headstock size. Now, a lot of times that can be fixed by using an adapter. There are adapters that will upsize or downsize the headstock threads for your lathe. The only downside of that is when you add an adapter, you're taking your turning farther away from the lathe headstock. The farther your turning is away from the lathe, the more chance there is for vibration or movement in that. So we don't want to use adapters unless we absolutely have to. We really want to have the connection to the lathe be as tight and close to that headstock as possible so that we get smooth, vibration-free turning on the lathe. The next measurement that we want to know is the Morris taper size. The Morris taper is the hole in the middle of the headstock and in the quill of the tailstock. That hole size is one of three sizes. It's either a Morris taper 1, Morris taper 2, or Morris taper 3. Now, I haven't seen too many Morris taper 3s. They're out there, of course, but the larger full-size lathes typically have a Morris taper 2 size hole, where the smaller midi lathes and mini lathes usually have a Morris taper 1. So you're going to want to know that, check with the manufacturers and see what they have. Now, the Morris taper is going to determine what accessories you can use, such as live center or drive centers in your lathe, and you're going to want to make sure you match those up. These are friction fit, meaning they slide into the hole and the tapered angle of that hole grips this, and then you will knock these out with your knockout bar. Now, almost every lathe that I know of comes with a knockout bar, so you don't have to worry about that. But essentially what happens is these get put in, and then the friction of tightening everything up is going to hold them in very well, and you'll need to use the knockout bar to loosen these up. The other thing you want to know when you're doing that is you want to hold the piece that you're knocking out so that it doesn't go flying across the room and damage the bearings, especially in the live centers. So the Morris taper size is important to know before you purchase a lathe. And the fourth measurement that you're going to want to know is the tool rest post size. The tool rest post receiver in the banjo is one size, and that post is necessary to match for any accessories. Typically, this would be additional tool rest. If you want to add a curved tool rest, an inside curve or an outside curve, or a longer tool rest to reach down in the bottom of bowls, or if you're doing small detail areas, you might want to even have a smaller tool rest. You're going to want to make sure that you're matching that tool rest post size with your banjo. Most of the large full-size lathes on the market use a 1-inch diameter post for the tool rest, and a lot of the smaller lathes, the midi and the mini lathes, use a 3/4 inch post. So you're going to want to know that, especially if you're going to be getting additional tool rest or any kind of accessories that goes in the banjo. Brand loyalty. It can be really confusing when you're looking for your first lathe. I remember when I was looking for mine, there was a lot of confusion about lathe manufacturers and accessories. Like the Nova chuck was really popular, and Nova also made a lathe. And it's easy to think, well, the Nova chuck goes with the Nova lathe. But then I started looking for other lathe manufacturers, and I saw other lathes that I was interested in, but then I didn't see that same manufacturer making a chuck. And I thought, well, what are we going to do for a chuck? Well, there's good news here. You do not have to be brand loyal when it comes to purchasing your lathe and the accessories for your lathe. You can mix and match any different manufacturers, and as a matter of fact, there's lots of manufacturers that just make lathe accessories, and there are manufacturers that just make lathes. So you need to be able to mix and match accessories from different brands. So a great example here is the Robust lathe that I turn on. Robust Tools also manufactures tool rests. They make really nice tool rests with a hardened top edge, and I recommend them. They make curved and extended tool rests, short rests, all sorts of different sizes, but there is one catch. You need to make sure that the tool rest post diameter matches the tool rest post receiver in your banjo. If it does, and the height of the tool rest matches what you need for your lathe, then you can use a robust tool rest on your lathe. The same goes for any accessory on your headstock. As long as the thread and the threading of the accessory matches the thread size of your headstock, you can attach it to your lathe. And same with the Morris taper. That's why those measurements were so important to know before you purchased your lathe, especially if you have accessories already. You want to make sure that you're going to be able to use those accessories with your lathe. Now, you can use an adapter, but like we mentioned, you don't want to use adapters unless you really have to. And realize you can mix and match brands however you would like in any configuration that you would like to get your wood turning projects completed. Power. Both the source of the power and the amount of the power are going to be important for your turning. Your source is going to be an outlet, obviously. A standard wall outlet at 110 volts There are many lathes that require that voltage, which is great. You can simply plug them in and go. Just know that you may need a little bit more amperage on your breaker in order to really power that lathe. Now, the lathes that are running at 220 volts, they're going to require a 220 volt outlet. Most of us don't have 220 in our shops or in our garages, but just know that you can hire an electrician to usually pretty easily move an existing line, a 220 line, and put an outlet in your location so that you can plug in your lathe. Most homes have a 220 volt outlet or circuit somewhere in the home for a dryer or something like that. And you can actually add an additional line using an electrician. If you know electricity, you can do it yourself. I don't like to play around with electricity. I would hire an electrician, and I did hire an electrician to put in 220 lines for my shop. And it wasn't that expensive or complicated, and they did it in one afternoon. So it's not that big of a deal. Don't be intimidated by that. You may want to check with an electrician before you purchase a lathe that's running 220 volts, but just know that it's doable. And the other nice thing is a 220 volt lathe is going to have a lot more power for turning than a 110 volt lathe. Now, as far as the power of the lathe and the horsepower, you're going to want to get as much horsepower as possible if you plan on turning larger bowls and or if you're going to be turning wet green wood that is heavy. The heavier the wood is on your lathe, the more power you need. A half horsepower motor is not going to be enough to turn a large wet bowl blank. What's going to happen is you're going to get bogged down, the motor will get bogged down and come to a screeching stop frequently, and that's not so much fun. So you're really going to want to purchase as much horsepower as you possibly can. I would recommend getting at least a 1 or 2 horsepower motor for your lathe. If you can get a larger horsepower motor, then get that if you can afford it, because you will appreciate it down the road when you get in a situation where you're turning a large bowl that is wet and heavy. You need that extra power to get through all of that material. Now, that being said, if you plan on turning dry wood, or you like purchasing bowl blanks that are dry, that are going to be smaller, and they're relatively balanced, then you can get away with a half horsepower motor or less and make decent turnings. Just know that the heavier wet wood does require more horsepower. Lathe location. Now, this is pretty important, and I see people overlooking this all the time. It's easy to do. Think about it. What do we have all over our shop? We have different pieces of equipment that are set on benches, that are set on countertops, that are kind of stored away until we need them. And it's really easy to think, well, I'm just going to use one of those counters and I'll set my lathe there and I'll be able to turn. You will be able to turn, but you're going to be limited. How will you be limited? Well, first of all, if you have your lathe setting on a countertop or a bench or even on a cart, what's going to happen is you're not going to have full mobility with your body to move around your turning and the work that you're doing as you're turning. And that's going to limit your movement. And if you've seen this video about moving your body, you understand that moving your body is the most important thing you can do when you're turning wood bowls. You do not want to be restricted in any way. The other thing that's super important is to get the height of your lathe just right. One of the ways and techniques that we use to determine that is to take your hands and cross them across your body, put your hands on the opposite shoulders, and then measure the height of your elbow at that point. That height should match the height of the center of the headstock. That is the ideal height. At that height, you won't be bending over and you won't be reaching up. There's a good chance that if you just set your lathe on a bench, that height is probably not going to be right. And even if it's off an inch or two higher or lower, you're going to be putting strain on your back and you're not going to be comfortable turning. What I highly recommend is to either use the stand or base that comes with a lathe or purchase the stand or base that your particular lathe is designed for. The base from the manufacturer is going to give you more room to move around, One of the things with the counter and the bench is that you can't get your feet underneath the turning. There are going to be times when you're turning that you need to have your feet underneath the lathe just a bit to get into the proper position. If you're turning at a bench top with a counter, you can't do that. So now you're stretching out and you're reaching across, and you're not going to make a good cut, and you're going to be uncomfortable, and you're going to make your body sore quicker that way. So consider purchasing or using the legs that come with your lathe. This is really important. Now, if you were thinking space-wise, I want to put this lathe on the counter just so I have extra room and I could park the car here, that's fine too. Figure out a way that you can get the lathe into an open area while you're using it. There are different mobility kits for a lot of lathes where you can put wheels on them, or you may have a mobile base that you can use to move the lathe out of the way when you need it and then bring it into an open space so that you have that free mobility around the lathe while you're turning. It's super important for a comfortable turn and for the ergonomics that are necessary while you're turning. Well, there you have it. There are 5 things that you really need to think about before you purchase your lathe. Let me know if you've considered all of these or if any of these has sparked any new thoughts in your mind by leaving me a comment below. Also, if you've liked this video, do me a favor and click that like button. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you. And subscribe if you're not already subscribing. Check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got tons of information, including online courses that are going to bring your wood bowl turning skills up to speed super fast. So check them out. All right, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and happy turning.